September 15th, 1939. If you're a nation living next door to a mighty war machine, you might have allies who've promised to back you up in a crisis. But sometimes, when that crisis comes, those promises turn out to have been empty. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the German Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, swarmed across Poland, penetrating to the east of Łódź and even taking Krakow. In the conquered territory, the SS began its police and security campaign against civilians, which is a nice way of saying terror and murder. Britain, France, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa declare war on Germany, and the war at sea begins as the SS Athena is torpedoed and sank by a U-boat. Here's what follows. In Poland, the Germans think that by now, most Polish forces have retired east of the Vistula River, but actually a lot of them have regrouped around Kutno. 10 Polish divisions under General Tadeusz Kostrzyba are there with more arriving. They attack across the Bzura River against Kluge's 8th Army. These are seriously heavy battles, and the Poles have success for the next few days, although the tide eventually turns against them. The Germans assemble reinforcements from Army Group South and will win the fighting by the end of the week. Far to the west on the 10th, the first large units of the British Expeditionary Force land in France, though small groups have been arriving since the 4th. Field Marshal Lord Gort is in command. This month, we'll see 160,000 men come to France, right? That's pretty much the same number of men who are taken prisoner by the Germans just this week at the Bzura River. By this time, the main focus of the invasion is on Warsaw, the capital. On the 9th, the 4th Panzer Division attacked the southeast Warsaw suburbs, but is beaten back. The German bombers, though, are ruthless in pounding the city. Hitler's generals propose that Warsaw be starved into surrender, but Hitler doesn't like the idea of a siege of any kind, and wants it bombed into submission. On the 14th, the bombing is even heavier than usual, and it is also Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. A third of the city's population of 1.2 million are Jews, and the Jewish quarter is attacked by air as the synagogues fill. On the 11th, the Germans cross the river San. On the 13th, a small German force crosses the Vistula south of Warsaw. The following day, the Germans enter Gdynia, and the Panzer Corps reaches Brest-Litovsk. That day, the 14th, they also enter Przemysl, the great fortress town that saw so much action in World War I. A third of its population are also Jews. 43 of the leading Jewish citizens are arrested, beaten, and then shot. Poland had pinned its hopes for surviving a German attack on Britain and France. Back in March, those two had given guarantees, eventually formalized that if Germany attacked Poland, they would fight.
An attempt were made to change the situation by force in such a way as to threaten Polish independence, why then that would inevitably start a general conflagration in which this country would be involved.
France, for example, had promised Warsaw that they would attack Germany's Siegfried defense line within 13 days of mobilizing. This isn't going to happen. The British had promised that they would immediately begin a bombing campaign of Germany. This hasn't happened. As Max Hastings writes, both powers' assurances reflected cynicism, for neither had the smallest intention of fulfilling them. The guarantees were designed to deter Hitler rather than provide credible military assistance to Poland. Of course, the Poles believed them. The Polish army was the 4th largest in Europe, so they thought that an invasion would last months at least, but they hadn't fully mobilized this year because the British and French wanted to avoid provoking Hitler. And though Poland has a lot of men in its army, the Germans are way better armed and armored. Poland was fairly poor. Its national budget was smaller than that of the city of Berlin. And something else I mentioned a couple weeks ago is coming back to haunt them. Even though the French had told them to concentrate their defenses behind the 3 big rivers at the center of the country, the Poles had chosen instead to defend the entire 1,500-kilometer border with Germany. Part of that had been to defend Polish industry, a lot of which was in the west. But by now, that choice is revealed as unwise as the power of the Blitzkrieg descends upon them. As for relying on more powerful allies, Antony Beevor writes in the Second World War, the fact remains that neither the British nor the French people were psychologically prepared for war, mainly because they had been misinformed by politicians, diplomats, and the press. Anyone who had tried to warn of Hitler's plans, such as Winston Churchill, was simply regarded as a warmonger. And those leaders, like British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, had, during the whole of the late 30s, done nothing but appease Hitler to the point that he had even complained that he had been thwarted of having a war in 1938 because the British and French kept accepting all of his increasing demands. But Chamberlain and company were okay with a rearmed Germany, partly assuming that other statesmen and politicians shared their values, so they did not understand Hitler's ruthlessness, partly because it would be a bulwark against Bolshevik expansion, partly because there were those who felt Germany had been treated poorly by the Treaty of Versailles, but mainly because they were horrified by the idea of another European war. When Hitler kept saying he just wanted to bring Germans in places like Austria and the Sudetenland back into the Reich, they didn't really see any reason to object. It was not until Hitler annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia back in March that they finally saw that Hitler's claim of uniting Germans was just a pretext to grabbing more territory. That's what finally forced Chamberlain to offer Poland guarantees in the first place. You know, back at home within Germany, there were plenty of people who had denounced the Nazis pre-war, and some did so about the Polish invasion as well. But there was a real deterrent to that by now. I mean, thousands of people have fled the tyranny of Germany over the past few years, but that's no longer possible. The borders were closed, and new restrictions were placed on movement. Over 1939, the whole Gestapo system had been spread to the recently annexed Czech lands, and Vienna and Prague were both under hard Nazi domination. Even now on the 9th, 630 Czech political prisoners are taken to Camp Dachau, north of Munich, and the atrocities in the conquered territory continue. I read in Martin Gilbert that on the 8th at Bedzin, 200 Jews die when they're forced into a synagogue, which is then set on fire. But this comes with a twist. The next day, the Germans accuse the Poles of this action and execute 30 of them in a town square. German Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner writes in his diary the 11th, "We are now issuing fierce orders, which I have drafted today myself. Nothing like the death sentence. There's no other way in the occupied territories." There are, of course, many German officers who do not share this view, but what can they do? Even Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence. This week, he comes to Poland to see the army in action, right? Well, his officers tell him of massacres, of things like Poles forced to dig mass graves, then being lined up and machine-gunned into them. So he goes to Hitler's headquarters train to protest. He sees Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, and tells him about this. Keitel tells Canaris to take the matter no further because this has been decided on by Hitler himself. Here's the thing. Keitel also tells Canaris that from now on, in just the second week of the war, every German army command in Poland will have to have a civilian chief in addition to the military one. The civilian one will be in charge of the racial extermination program. Keitel's words, not mine. Well, Canaris says nothing when he meets Hitler, but according to Karl Gödler, former mayor of Leipzig, Canaris returns from Poland broken by his country's conduct of the war. What Keitel calls racial extermination is given another name on the 13th as units of the Death's Head SS begin cleansing and security measures. These included, according to its own report, the arrest and shooting of large numbers of suspicious elements, plunderers, Jews, and Poles, many of whom are killed trying to escape. And the week comes to an end, with the Germans advancing ever further into Poland and taking prisoners in the hundreds of thousands. The Poles now felt that they were on their own, though this week Canada did declare war on Germany. The French formed a war cabinet, and the Allied Supreme War Council had its first meeting. I mentioned Wagner's diary. Well, on September 9th, Hitler's chief of staff, General Franz Halder, was talking with Wagner about the future of Poland. Wagner would write in his diary, "It is the Führer's and Göring's intention to destroy and exterminate the Polish nation. More than that cannot even be hinted at in writing." there were many German officers who despised Hitler. German officers had prided themselves on being apolitical, but in the 1930s they had been seduced by the idea of an increased military and massive rearmament. And now, well, Antony Beevor puts it like this: opportunism went hand in hand with cowardice in the face of authority. 19th century German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck once said that moral courage was rare in Germany and it deserted a German completely the moment he put on a uniform. Well, the Nazis had by now managed to get everyone into uniform, even the children. If you like this content and wish for us to continue, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com or timeghost.tv. Every dollar does in fact count and will allow us to not only continue this series, but make it ever better and ever more in depth. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.